You need to leave. Right now.
You promised you'd choose me.
Your wife is in that room, listening to your child's heartbeat. I'm her brother, just flew in from Singapore.
The sound came first. 142 beats per minute. Steady, rhythmic, reliable. It was the most reliable sound in the room, and it did not belong to Caroline. She lay in the hospital bed and listened to her daughter's heartbeat and thought about the chair. The chair was to her left. It was the kind of chair hospitals put in rooms to suggest that someone would be sitting in it. It had a faded blue cushion. It had scratches on the armrests that told the story of every person who had ever occupied it. It was the kind of chair designed for waiting, for accompanying, for being present in the particular way that mattered most. It was empty. It had been empty for 53 minutes. The nurse had come by twice. The first time she adjusted the monitor and noted the reading on her tablet and smiled at Caroline with the practiced warmth of a woman who had learned to be professionally kind in the way that required almost nothing. The second time she asked through the intercom whether Mr. Bauer was nearby, Caroline said he had stepped out. He would be back. She did not know this. She said it anyway. She had been saying things like this for years, filling in the gaps, smoothing the surface, making the story of her marriage sound complete when what it actually was a story with a great many unanswered pages. The room smelled like antiseptic and the faint floral sweetness of the lotion she had worn since college. She had worn it every day for 12 years. Derek used to say he loved it. He said it reminded him of how she smelled on their first date. He had said this many times in the early years of their marriage, and then he had stopped saying it sometime around the 4th month of her pregnancy, and she had not noticed the stopping until right now, lying in this bed, smelling herself, realizing that he had stopped noticing her. She had been 34 years old for 6 weeks. She was 7 months pregnant. She was wearing a hospital gown that tied in the back and did not close properly. The pillow behind her lower back was not quite right. She had adjusted it 4 times. She had been having Braxton Hicks contractions since that afternoon. The dress rehearsal kind. The kind the body uses to practice for something real. Dr. Voss was not worried. She had been very clear about that. Not worried, but monitoring. 2 hours minimum, possibly until morning. The baby was fine. Caroline was fine. This was precautionary. Derek had said he would stay. That was 53 minutes ago. She reached for her phone. She opened it. She closed it. The light from the screen was bright in the low-lit room. She set it face down on the blanket over her knees and looked at the ceiling and breathed. The ceiling was white, institutional white, the kind of white that had never been an aesthetic choice. There was a small water stain in the upper right corner shaped like nothing in particular. She looked at it for a long time. Derek had texted at 7:14. He said he was stepping out for air. He said he would be right back. It was 8:51. She did not text him. She had learned, over 5 years of marriage, not to reach for him when she already knew the reaching would bring back something that did not satisfy. She had learned to absorb the small daily disappointments the way you learn to absorb cold, gradually, without noticing each individual degree until the cumulative chill had become simply the temperature of her life. The baby moved, a slow roll, something interior and tidal, a being rearranging herself in the limited but sufficient world of Caroline's body. Caroline put her hand on her stomach. She breathed. The door did not open. She looked at the window across the room. The hospital was on the 6th floor. Outside, the city spread itself across the dark like something deliberate and indifferent. Lights scattered. Traffic moved in its slow pulse. People were going somewhere in cars and on foot, and by subway and by every means available to them, and none of them were here, and she was here, and the chair was empty. She closed her eyes. She was not asleep. She was doing the thing she had learned to do inside her marriage when the silence became too specific. She was being very, very still, and hoping that stillness would feel like peace. It did not. It felt like waiting. The door swung open. She opened her eyes, a different nurse, young, dark hair and a bun. She came in with a tablet and checked the monitor numbers and made a note and looked at Caroline with the checking kind of look. That meant everything was fine. Everything was fine. Caroline adjusted the pillow. And then she saw him. It was through the small rectangular window in the door, the kind of window hospitals design so that nurses can check without disturbing. She was not looking at it deliberately. Her eyes moved there the way eyes move toward light or sound when there is nothing else demanding their attention. Through that window, across the corridor slightly to the left, under fluorescent lights that made everything in the hallway look slightly wrong, she saw Derek. He was not alone. The woman was young. She looked younger than Caroline in the way that women who have not yet lived their hardest years can look younger than women who have. Her hair was dark and pulled into a low bun. She wore a camel-colored coat that Caroline had never seen. She was standing close to Derek. She was speaking to him, and Derek was holding her hand. Not the way you hold someone's hand in a hospital corridor because something frightening has happened. Not the way you take someone's hand in a gesture of sympathy or support. He was holding her hand with both of his, covering it completely. The way you hold something you are afraid of losing. The way you hold something precious. The way he used to hold Caroline's hand once, in the very early days before he stopped. The woman said something. Derek bent his head toward her. It was a motion Caroline recognized. It was the motion of a man who had been intimate with this person in rooms and in moments and in the specific texture of ordinary daily life. It was the motion of a man who had earned the right to lean in close. Caroline looked at the monitor. 142 beats per minute. She looked back at the door. Her husband was comforting another woman in the hallway of the hospital where his child was being monitored. The air in her mouth went dry. The pillow behind her back was wrong again. She did not adjust it. She looked at the ceiling instead. The water stain shaped like nothing. She breathed. She said, barely above a whisper, to no one except the monitor god. Okay. She did not cry. Not yet. The tears were there. They were absolutely there, somewhere behind her sternum, waiting their turn. But what was happening right now in this moment was not the kind of thing that produces tears immediately. It was the kind of thing that produces a specific quiet. A held breath that you realize you have been holding for months, possibly years, without knowing you were holding it. She had known. That was the thing. Not the specific fact of the woman in the camel coat. She had not known that woman, had not imagined that exact scene. But she had known the shape of it. She had known the outline of the thing she was not letting herself see. She had been very good at not letting herself see. The baby moved again. Smaller this time, a settling. Caroline put her hand on her stomach. I hear you, she said, very softly. I am here. The door opened. She looked up. Her heart did the thing hearts do when they are still hoping for something that they no longer have any reason to hope for. It was Derek. He came in with his expression arranged into concern. He was very skilled at arranging his expressions. She had always thought of this as sensitivity. She was beginning to understand it differently. He pulled the chair close to the bed. He sat in it. He reached for her hand. Hey, he said. Sorry, that took longer than I thought. The call, it ran over. How are you? How's the monitoring looking? She let him take her hand. She looked at his face. He was 38 years old and handsome in the way that men who have been told their whole lives that they are charming tend to be handsome. He had the kind of confidence that came not from having earned anything in particular, but from never having been seriously challenged. He was wearing the same suit he had put on that morning. His shirt collar was open at the button. She looked at the window. She said nothing. In the space between what she knew and what she would eventually do about it, she heard her phone vibrate on the bedside table. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She did not answer. Derek's eyes drifted to his own phone. He scrolled. She watched him read something. She watched his expression not change. He was very good at that too. 3 minutes passed. She picked up her phone. One text message, unknown number. She read it. It said, Caro, it is Grant. Patricia called me. I am in the city. Are you at the hospital? Tell me where you are. She read it twice. She had not called Grant. She had not called anyone except Dr. Voss, and then the hospital to confirm her monitoring appointment. She had told her mother about the appointment at dinner 3 days ago, mentioned it the way you mention something routine, something you expect to be fine. Patricia Whitfield heard the routine in her daughter's voice the way only a mother who had been watching her daughter perform fine for 5 years can hear it. And Patricia had done what Patricia always did when her instincts fired. She waited. She watched. She acted. Caroline typed one word back. The room number. She set the phone face down on the blanket. Derek had not looked up. She looked at the ceiling again, the water stain, the institutional white, the monitor with its steady, reliable 142 beats. She waited. 22 minutes passed. Derek left the room to take a call. She could see him through the rectangular window. He was in the same corridor where she had seen him before. He was on the phone. His free hand hung at his side, the way a person's hand hangs when they are keeping it deliberately still. She did not look for the woman in the camel coat this time. She did not need to. The door at the far end of the corridor opened. A man walked through it. He wore a dark coat over a dark suit. He was tall. He moved through the hospital corridor with the particular quality of a person who knows exactly where they are going and why. He did not rush. There was no wasted motion in him. He scanned the room numbers as he walked, and then he found hers, and he stopped. Through the small window in the door, Caroline watched her brother see her husband. Grant Whitfield stood very still for a long moment. He looked at Derek with the focused attention of a person assessing something they have already decided about. He did not let the looking show on his face. He filed it, and then he turned and opened the door to Caroline's room. He stepped inside. He closed the door behind him quietly. He looked at his sister. She looked at him. She had not seen Grant in 4 months. Business, geography, the particular way that adult siblings can let time expand between them without meaning harm. Now he was here, in this room, in this hospital, and the sight of him did something unexpected. She had thought she would feel relief. She did feel relief. But she also felt something she had not prepared for. She felt seen. Not the managed version of herself that she had been presenting to the world and to herself for years. The real version. The one her brother had known since she was 12 years old and learning to be careful with her feelings. She did not cry. She lifted her chin. "You did not have to come," she said. He sat in the chair that had been empty. He sat in it and he said, "I know." He did not ask what had happened. He did not demand the story. He sat in the empty chair and he remained in it, and the air in the room changed. It became something that was not quite peace and was not quite safety, but was closer to both than anything she had felt all night. The monitor kept its rhythm, 142 beats. Grant looked at it. He was quiet for a moment. "Strong," he said. "She has been strong all night," Caroline said. They were quiet together. The comfortable kind of quiet. The kind that two people can only inhabit if they have known each other long enough and have been through enough together that silence does not require filling. The door opened. Derek walked back in. He stopped. He looked at his brother-in-law sitting in the chair. Something moved through his expression and was gone. He was good at making things go. He was very, very good at that, Grant, he said. The ease in his voice was almost perfect. Almost. "I did not know you were in town." "I was not," Grant said. 4 words. "Correct, unhurried. Final." Derek looked between them. He looked at Caroline. She gave him nothing. She had 5 years of practice at giving him nothing when it mattered. Well, Derek said, "Good. It is good that you are here." Caroline could use the company. He reached for his jacket on the other chair. "I was going to get coffee. Can I get either of you something?" "She is fine," Grant said. He did not look at Derek when he said it. He was still looking at Caroline. Derek nodded. He went. The door closed behind him. Caroline exhaled. It was the first full, complete, uncalculated breath she had taken in 2 hours. Grant waited. "He was in the hallway," she said after a long moment. "Before you arrived. With someone. A woman. Young." He was holding her hand, both of his hands over hers. "The way you hold something you are afraid of losing." Grant looked at her. He did not react. He held what she had said the way a person holds something breakable, carefully. "How long?" he asked. "I do not know," she said, "a while before tonight." She thought about the conference calls that lasted past midnight. She thought about the business trips. She thought about January 23rd, the day the baby kicked for the first time, and she had gone to find Derek in his home office, and he had said, without looking up from his screen, "That is great, Care," and gone back to his screen. "I let a lot of things go," she said. "I was very good at letting things go." Grant looked at the monitor. He looked at it the way he looks at things he is deciding about, with complete and patient attention. "You do not have to decide anything tonight," he said. "I know, but when you are ready, you call me." She nodded. "Then, Grant, how did Patricia know to call you?" Something almost like a smile happened at the corner of his mouth. "She said you sounded too calm when you told her about the monitoring. She said you sounded the way you did when you were 12 and you broke the window in the study and did not want anyone to know." Caroline looked at the ceiling. "I did not break that window," she said. "I know. You broke it. I know." A pause. "But you were the one who looked calm." She laughed. It was small and thin at the edges, and it surprised her completely. It was real. The first real thing she had done since 8:51. Grant stayed for 4 more hours. He did not mention Derek again. He did not ask questions she was not ready to answer. He sat in the chair that had been empty and he made it occupied, and that single act of chosen presence was the thing she would carry longest from this night. When Dr. Voss came in at 6:15 to clear Caroline for discharge, she noted without comment that the room had exactly the right number of people in it. Derek did not return. That was also an answer. Caroline lay in the half-light with the monitor steady and the stars just barely beginning through the window and her daughter's heartbeat in the air, and she knew 3 things. She knew what she had seen. She knew what it meant. She knew what she had to do. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she rested. And that was enough. For now, that was enough. This was where the story of Caroline Whitfield Bauer truly began. Not in confusion, not in denial. In the particular quiet, terrible clarity that arrives when you finally let yourself see the thing you have been looking away from. The coffee was bitter. She had made it wrong. Too much ground, too little water, the ratio off by exactly 1 careless scoop. She stood at the kitchen counter and held the mug and looked out the window at the morning that was doing its ordinary, indifferent thing, and she thought, this is what your life looks like from the outside. Ordinary. Indifferent. A woman in her kitchen holding a mug she made wrong. She drank it anyway. It tasted like the last few years of her marriage. It was 3 days after the hospital. In those 3 days, she had done 4 things. She had called Rosalie from the car on the way home from the hospital, while Grant sat beside her and looked out the window and pretended not to be listening, which was its own form of kindness. Rosalie had answered on the first ring because Rosalie always answered on the first ring for Caroline, which was something Caroline had not adequately appreciated until this morning. She had driven past Derek's office building on a Tuesday morning and parked in the parking garage across the street and sat there for 40 minutes. She had not known what she was looking for. She had known she needed to look anyway. At 7:15, the woman in the camel coat walked through the revolving door of Derek's building. She had a coffee cup. She had a bag over one shoulder. She was checking her phone. She looked like a person. This was the thing that undid Caroline a little. She had been hoping for something she could simplify. The woman was simply a person. Getting on with her day, Caroline had driven home. She had then gone to the filing cabinet in Derek's home office and pulled out the folder marked Joint Accounts, and she had sat at the kitchen table and gone through 18 months of credit card statements. 11 hotel stays she did not know about. None of them in cities where she knew Derek had traveled for work. 43 restaurant charges. Restaurants that were not the kind of restaurants he and Caroline went to. They were the kind of restaurants where a man takes someone when he is trying to impress them. Romantic ones. Expensive ones. A wine list and a tasting menu and the particular atmosphere of somewhere chosen. A jewelry store in Soho. 3 separate visits. Caroline had closed her eyes when she found the jewelry store. Derek knew she did not wear much jewelry. She had said it on their 3rd date. She had said it the way you share small honest things about yourself with someone you are hoping to know better. She had never imagined he would use this information the way he had. She sat now at the kitchen table with the printed statements laid out in front of her in the particular order of someone who has organized chaos, because organizing chaos is the only thing available to her hands right now. She had a glass of water she was not drinking. The baby had been quiet all morning, not the alarming quiet, just the sleeping kind. She thought, how does a person spend this much money building a second life, and then come home and ask how your day was and actually look like he means it? She had not been able to answer that question in 3 days. She picked up her phone, she put it down, she picked it up again. Grant answered on the first ring. It was 10:45 in the evening. He did not mention the hour. He never did. Hey, he said. Grant, she said. I need to tell you more, and I need you to listen without reacting. Can you do that? Probably not, he said. But I will try. She told him everything. The parking garage. The woman in the camel coat getting coffee at 7:15 and looking like a person. The 18 months of credit card statements. The jewelry store in Soho, which Derek knew she would never visit, which was precisely the point. When she finished talking, the silence on his end was full. She could feel him processing it. She could feel him containing the reaction she had asked him not to have, putting it in a room inside himself and closing the door, so she did not have to manage his feelings on top of her own. Okay, he said. I do not want you to, she began. Caroline, his voice was steady and low. Are you safe right now, you and the baby? Yes. He does not know that I know. Good. A pause. I am going to ask Marcus to do a preliminary review. Discreet. Can he start tonight? Marcus Reed, Grant's chief legal officer. A man who spoke in action items and moved faster than most people thought possible. Aye, she said, and stopped. I know you did not want to need this, Grant said. She was quiet. You can need it anyway, he said. She started to cry then. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that announced itself and demanded attention. The quiet, specific kind. The kind that has been waiting patiently behind a door for 3 days and has finally been allowed through it. These were the tears of a woman who has been carrying something very heavy alone for the first time, setting it down. Not completely. Not permanently. Just right now. I did not want this to be my life, she said. I know, he said. And then after a moment, but it is not going to stay this way. I promise you that. She pressed her back against the kitchen cabinets. She had slid down at some point without noticing the way you end up on the floor when you are crying the right kind of tears. The floor was cold through her pajamas. There was a bowl of cereal on the counter she had made for herself an hour ago and had not eaten. The kitchen was too bright for this kind of feeling, and she did not move to change the light. This was the first mirror moment that mattered. Not because it was dramatic, because it was ordinary. A woman in pajamas on a kitchen floor at 10:45 at night, 7 months pregnant, with a bowl of cereal on the counter, having reached the bottom of her capacity to pretend. She was here, she was still here. The floor was solid beneath her. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough. She stayed on the floor for another 20 minutes after she hung up with Grant. She looked at the baseboards. She looked at the corner where the cabinets met the wall. She looked at the small chip in the grout between the floor tiles that she had been meaning to point out to Derek for 6 months. He had never gotten around to fixing it. She had never pushed. She got up. She rinsed the cereal bowl. She put it in the drying rack. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to the bedroom. Derek was already asleep. She could see the shape of him under the covers. She could hear his breathing. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him with the strange, complete calm of a woman who has just made a decision she cannot unmake. She got into bed on her side. She lay very still. The baby shifted. That slow, rolling interior tide. A small being adjusting her position in the world she occupied, untroubled by the complexity of the one she was about to enter. Caroline put her hand on her stomach. "Just us," she said, barely above a breath. "For now. Just us." She meant it more than she had ever meant anything. The morning came without fanfare. It came the way mornings come in the middle of something terrible, with an absolute indifference to what has happened. The light going through the curtains at the usual angle, the coffee maker starting at the preset time, the city doing its ordinary work outside the window. Derek left early. "A breakfast meeting," he said. She said fine. She made no visible notation of the fact that it was a Tuesday and he never had breakfast meetings on Tuesdays. She waited until the elevator outside the apartment door had chimed twice. Then she called Helen Marsh. Helen Marsh had been recommended by a woman named Dana, who sat next to Caroline at a prenatal class and mentioned, in the context of something else entirely, that she knew the best divorce attorney in the city. Caroline had taken the number. She had put it in her phone under the name Dana's dentist, and she had not looked at it again for 3 weeks, not until this morning. Helen answered with the professional warmth of a woman who had heard every kind of beginning. She said, "Tell me what is happening," Caroline told her. She had the facts organized now, the hotel receipts, the jewelry store, the restaurants, the woman at the office. She spoke in a measured voice, and she noticed as she spoke how completely different this felt from calling Grant. Grant was love, Grant was family. Helen Marsh was something else. She was clarity made human. She was the part of the world that was going to help Caroline understand the shape of what came next. When Caroline finished, Helen was quiet for exactly 1 moment. "I want to ask you something before we discuss strategy," Helen said. "How long have you known?" Caroline opened her mouth to say 1 month, the hospital. That was when she knew. What came out instead was years. She surprised herself completely. "That is more common than people expect," Helen said. There was no judgment in it, only recognition. "I did not let myself know," Caroline said. "There is a difference." "There is," Helen said. "And that difference matters more than you might think. Because it means you are not starting from denial. You are starting from clarity. That is a significant advantage in what comes next." "He has a prenuptial agreement," Caroline said. "I signed it 5 years ago. I did not have an attorney review it before I signed." Helen was quiet again. That particular kind of quiet that attorneys use when they are not surprised, but are being careful with the information. "Do you have access to the document?" Helen asked. "We have a safe." "Yes." "Good. Bring it to me. We will look at it together in Caroline. One more thing. For now, do not change anything. Do not move money. Do not change access to any account. Do not have any conversation with him that indicates you have taken any of these steps. You simply continue as normal. Can you do that?" "Yes," Caroline said, and meant it. She had been doing something very much like that for years. A few more days would not be difficult. She made a second cup of coffee after she hung up. She made it correctly this time. She stood at the kitchen counter and drank it and felt, for the first time in 3 days, the specific sensation of moving forward. Not running, not flailing, moving forward. One deliberate step at a time. Outside, the city was doing its ordinary work. Traffic, people, the small ordinary machinery of a day. She had things to do. She got dressed. The door opened at 11:15 and Grant came in. He was wearing the dark coat again, the same one from the hospital. She wondered if he had been carrying it all week in anticipation, the way he sometimes prepared for things without announcement, simply making himself ready for what he knew was coming. He hugged her at the door, firmly, with the particular care of a man who was aware of the pregnancy and aware also that his sister had not been touched kindly in a long time, in any way that was not calculated. He stepped back and looked at her. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired," she said. "Sit down." She sat. He did not. He walked through the apartment with his hands in his coat pockets and the particular quality of attention he brought to everything, which was total and unhurried. He looked at the rooms. He was not snooping, he was understanding. The way a good builder walks through a structure and reads the evidence of how it was put together and what that means about what is holding and what is not. He stopped at the nursery doorway. The room was painted a soft sage green. She had chosen it herself. She had gone to the paint store on a Saturday morning, alone, because Derek said he would come and then had something else to do, and she had held up 40 sample cards in the morning light and chosen this one. It was the color of new things, the color of something just barely starting. The crib was assembled. She had put together the crib herself because Derek said he would do it and then did not. The bookshelf had books on it, real ones she had been collecting for months. There was a small woven rug on the floor and a pattern she had loved immediately. The mobile above the crib was still in its box, on the floor, in the corner. Derek was going to hang it. He had said so 6 weeks ago, and then 3 weeks ago, and then last week. The box had sat on the floor of the nursery, becoming gradually invisible, the way things become invisible when you have stopped expecting them to change. Grant looked at the box on the floor for a long moment. He said nothing about it. He turned around. "Tell me about the woman," he said. She told him. Name, position, timeline, documentation. She told him about Amber Cole. She laid it out the way she had learned to lay things out since the hospital, factual and complete, without the apologetic hedging she had spent years wrapping around every difficult truth. Grant nodded as she talked. He did not interrupt. He looked like a man who had been expecting this information and was simply confirming the details of something he had already prepared to respond to. When she finished, he looked at her. "What do you want, Caroline?" he said. She opened her mouth. She closed it. This question. She had not been asked this question in years. Not like this. Not with someone waiting for the real answer, the actual answer, the one that lived underneath the polished responses she had trained herself to give. "What do you want?" he said again. "Not what is practical. Not what avoids conflict. Not what other people need from you. What do you want?" She sat with the question. She let it sit in the room between them without filling it. "I want to protect my baby," she said finally. "I want to not be afraid anymore. I want to stop living inside a story that is not mine." Grant was quiet for a moment. "Just that." "Then we will do that," he said. She started to say his name. He held up one hand slightly. "I am not going to do anything you do not choose. This is your life, your decisions. I am here as your brother, not as leverage, not as a resource to deploy. Just as your brother who has been watching you manage this alone and is asking to stop being kept at a distance." He paused. "But I need you to understand something. You have not been as alone in this as you thought you were. Not for a single day. You chose not to call me. That was your right. You can choose differently now." He made one call. He stepped to the window and she heard fragments of his voice, low and clipped and entirely certain. "Marcus. Preliminary asset review. Discreet. Tonight. Full picture by end of week." He came back to the table. "When Derek gets home tonight," he said. "What will you do?" "I will act normal," she said. "I will give him every chance to tell me the truth himself. I will watch what he chooses and when he does not tell you." She looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked at her brother. "Then I will know exactly who I am dealing with," she said. "And I will know what I need to do next." Grant looked at her for a long moment. He had the quality, rare in people, of really looking. Not performing attention, actually looking. "Okay," he said. He stayed for 3 hours. They had lunch from a place she liked, ordered in, eaten at the kitchen table. They talked about other things too. Their mother. A memory from when they were children, a trip they took once to the mountains where the roads were so narrow and the drop was so steep that even their father had gripped the dashboard. They laughed at the memory. It was good to laugh. Before he left, Grant went back to the nursery. He did not ask her. He just went. She heard the rustling of the box being open, the instructions unfolded, the small sounds of a thing being assembled, then the particular soft sound of something being hung, adjusted, secured. He came out of the nursery and walked to the door and put on his coat. "Call me," he said. "I will," she said. She closed the door behind him. She stood in the hallway of the apartment she had shared with her husband for 3 years. She looked at the photographs on the wall. She looked at the print she had chosen, and the small mirror she had chosen, and the table with its bowl of keys, and the apartment key that belonged only to her that she had somehow never thought of as only hers. She walked to the nursery doorway. The mobile hung above the crib. Small stars in silver and pale blue and a soft white that caught the light and turned it gentle. They turned slowly in the draft from the hallway. 1/4 turn. Another. A slow, steady orbit. She stood there and watched them turn. She breathed. This is how reclamation begins. Not with a declaration, not with a confrontation. With a brother who hangs a mobile because it needs to be hung, and a woman who stands in the doorway of the room she prepared for her child and watches something that was wrong become right. She breathed. Derek came home at 6:47. He was in a good mood. His moods were entirely disconnected from what he had done. They were not responses to his life. They were performances for the audience of whoever was in the room. His good moods arrived when he wanted to be perceived as relaxed and easy and unconcerned. They were not evidence of peace. They were evidence of management. She was only beginning to see this clearly. He kissed her cheek at the door. The kiss landed slightly wrong, slightly off the mark, the way a thing done from habit rather than feeling tends to land. He smelled like the cologne he always wore. She used to love that smell. She noticed now that she did not. He asked how she was feeling. She said fine. He asked about the baby. She said the baby had been moving all afternoon. He said that was great and went to pour himself a glass of wine. He did not offer her any she could not drink. They both knew this. He had always known this. But for the first months of the pregnancy, he would pour his glass and then pause and say something like, "I cannot believe I am drinking and you are not. That is genuinely unfair to you." He would make it a small joke. It was a small joke that said, "I see you. I am thinking about you. You are in my mind." He had stopped saying it some months back. She could not pinpoint exactly when. That was the thing about the slow erosions. They did not announce themselves. They simply happened and you absorbed them and rearranged your expectations downward, degree by degree, until the original expectation was no longer visible. She made dinner. He talked about his day for 22 minutes. She counted this time. She had not counted it before. She wondered if she should have been counting all along, if the numbers would have told her something earlier. He talked about a client and a deal and a problem with the New Jersey project and a colleague who had been difficult. He talked about the drive home and a parking situation and a restaurant he wanted to try. He did not ask about her day. She noticed. She had always noticed. She had simply chosen not to notice the noticing. She cleared the dishes. He went to his office. The door closed with a small, decisive sound. She sat at the kitchen table and the grief arrived. Not the crying kind. Not yet. The quieter kind. The kind that moves through you without dramatic announcement. The grief for the specific good year she remembered. The third year of their marriage. The year she had thought of as the foundation. They had rented a house in Maine for 2 weeks. She remembered the gray-weathered shingles. The smell of the ocean and the pines mixed together in a way that seemed impossible until you were there, and then seemed completely inevitable. The porch with 2 chairs and morning coffee, and the sound of the water. Derek had been present that trip. Actually genuinely present. He had been the man she thought she had married. He had laughed in ways that were not performed. He had taken her hand on walks without calculation. She had thought, this is the real thing. This is what we are. She thought now, was that trip a guilt payment? Had he already started? Was she living in a vacation from his real life without knowing it? Had the main house been purchased with credit card charges she had not yet found? The not knowing was its own specific suffering, perhaps worse than the knowing would be. She went to the hall closet. She reached up to the top shelf, the box of photographs she kept there, physical prints from the early years, before everything became digital and available only on screens. She sat on the floor of the hallway with the box on her knees, and she went through them slowly. Their first trip together, New Orleans. She had a terrible sunburn in every photograph and did not remember minding it. His sister's wedding. They were not married yet. He had kept his arm around her the entire reception in a way that felt possessive and romantic simultaneously. A Sunday at a park in their first year. Blanket on the grass, deli sandwiches, a book she was reading that she could not now remember. He had taken the photograph. She was looking up at him from the book and laughing at something he had said. She looked at that one for a long time. The version of herself looking up at him with her whole face, unguarded, completely. Oh, she had loved him so much. Look at how much she had loved him. She put the photograph face down on the carpet. She found the second anniversary photograph. An Italian restaurant in the West Village, heavy white tablecloths, low candles, the particular atmosphere of a place where you are supposed to feel that the evening is significant. In the photograph, Derek was looking at the camera. He was smiling the precise smile he used for photographs. The smile that looked like warmth and was actually performance. She was looking at him, not at the camera, at him. Looking at him with the particular focus of a woman who does not yet know that the thing she is studying is not the thing she thinks it is. She put that photograph face down too. She sat on the floor of the hallway for 11 minutes. Then she got up. She put the photographs in the box. She put the box on the shelf. She closed the closet door. She went to the bathroom. She ran cold water over her wrists. She looked at her face in the mirror. The face looking back at her was tired. It was also surprisingly clear. I am not crazy, she thought. I know what I saw, not as a question. not as a hope, as a statement, as a fact, as the first solid piece of ground she had stood on in days. She had spent years learning to distrust her own perceptions inside this marriage. The small erosions of certainty. The moments where she had noticed something and brought it to Derek, and he had turned it around until she was apologizing for noticing. The way she had gradually learned to question herself before she questioned him. She was done with that. She knew what she saw. She was not crazy. These were facts, not feelings, not misunderstandings. These were the receipts of a life he had been building alongside hers without her knowledge. She was not going to shrink from them. The baby moved. One decisive kick, right under her ribs, as if to agree. I know, she said to the mirror, to herself, to the small being pressing against her from the inside. She went to bed before Derek came out of his office. She lay on her side in the dark, and she listened to the city outside, and she thought about Helen Marsh, about the prenuptial agreement she had signed 5 years ago at a small conference table, alone, because Derek said it was just a formality, because Derek said it was standard, because Derek said she could get her own lawyer if she wanted, but honestly, it was just paperwork. She had signed it without a lawyer. She had trusted him. I stayed because I believed him, she thought. That is not stupidity. That is trust. Those are not the same thing. This was the second validation whisper. It arrived without fanfare, without announcement, a statement she made to herself in the dark that was more true than anything she had thought in months. She fell asleep before Derek came to bed. She woke at 5:30. She lay still for a moment and listened. She could hear him breathing. She could hear the particular quality of a sleeping person who takes up most of the space in a room even when they are not doing anything. She got up carefully. She went to the kitchen. She made coffee. She stood at the window and drank it while the city came slowly back to light. Then she picked up her phone and called Helen Marsh. The meeting was set for that afternoon. Helen's office was on the 41st floor of a building in Midtown. The elevator had the specific quality of a very good building's elevator, quiet and clean and efficient, the kind that arrives exactly when you press the button and does not make you feel like you are waiting. Helen met her at the reception area personally. This was, Caroline would learn, the kind of thing Helen did. She did not wait for clients to be brought to her. She came to them. In the conference room, over water and the kind of coffee that appears to have been made by someone who takes it seriously, Helen laid out exactly what the prenuptial agreement said, and exactly what that meant, and exactly what Caroline's options were. The infidelity clause, the documentation requirements, the financial disclosures Derek had made and had not made, the way the agreement was structured to protect Derek's existing assets before the marriage, and the way it addressed assets accumulated during the marriage, and the particular question of whether an agreement remained enforceable when one party had violated its terms. Caroline listened. She asked questions. She did not apologize for the questions. She did not hedge them. She simply asked. An hour later, she walked out of Helen Marsh's office with 3 things. A clear understanding of what she was dealing with, a clear understanding of what was possible, and the specific grounding knowledge that she was not navigating this alone. She stopped outside on the sidewalk. The afternoon was cold and bright. People moved past her in both directions. She took one complete breath. She started walking. The confrontation did not happen on her terms. She had imagined, in the days after the hospital and the credit card statements in Helen's office, that she would choose the moment. She had imagined that she would have everything organized, every document in its place, every word in its proper order, and she would sit across from Derek at a table somewhere and say what needed to be said with the controlled certainty of a person who has done the preparation. Life did not honor this plan. It was 4 days after Grant's visit. 30 weeks, she had a regular checkup with Dr. Voss. Routine, every detail of this appointment was in Derek's shared calendar. She had told him twice. She had reminded him that morning over coffee, and he had looked up from his phone and said, "Of course I will be there," with the warm certainty of a man who intended nothing he was saying. She sat in the waiting room of the OB, clinic at 9:45, and texted him. No answer. She texted again at 10:05. No answer. Dr. Voss saw her at 10:20. Everything was good. The baby was good. Weight was good. Position was good. Heartbeat was good. Dr. Voss asked how she was sleeping, and she said she was sleeping adequately, which was close to true. Dr. Voss looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of a clinician who is also a person, and then handed her a pamphlet about prenatal mental health support and said, matter-of-factly, that these were resources if she ever wanted them. Caroline took the pamphlet. She said thank you. She meant it. She walked out of the appointment into the elevator lobby. She pressed the button. She waited. The elevator opened and Derek walked out of it. He was in his work clothes. He had his AirPods in. He had one finger raised in her direction in the universal gesture of wait one moment. She watched him finish the call. She watched him pull the AirPod out. She watched the exact moment he registered her face. "Care, hey," he said. "I am so sorry, that ran long. I was just—" "The appointment has been over for 15 minutes, she said. I know. I got stuck on this call." He reached into his pocket for his phone. His thumbs moved. She watched his thumbs move. She knew what he was doing. He was texting someone. She knew who the someone was. "Derek," she said. "Put the phone away." He put it in his pocket. She looked at him. This man, her husband, 38 years old, handsome, confident in the way of someone who has never been seriously tested. She looked at him carefully and completely, the way she had looked at the photographs on the floor of the hallway, trying to find the real thing inside the image. She did not find it. "I know about Amber," she said. The color changed in his face. She had seen him manage his expressions for 5 years, and she had never seen this. The specific physical draining of a face that has been caught. It was not a performance. It was involuntary. For once, he was not managing anything. 3 full seconds of silence. "Caroline," he said, the way a person says a name when they are stalling. "I know how long it has been," she said. "I have the credit card statements, 18 months, the hotels, the jewelry store in Soho." She paused. "I have seen her. I know where she works. This is not," he started. "This is not what you think." She almost laughed. "Almost. I am going to ask you one question," she said. "One chance to tell me the truth. Everything. All of it. Right now. If you choose to tell me the truth, we handle this differently than if you do not." He looked at the floor. She watched his jaw. She watched him calculate. She watched him decide. "She does not mean anything to me," he said. There it was. She had known it would be that. She had known the first words would be a minimization. She had prepared for it. She still flinched. "How long?" she said. He did not answer. She let the silence work. "Derek, how long?" 2 years, he said, barely audible, like pulling something out of himself. 2 years. The elevator at the end of the lobby opened. A nurse walked past them with a cart. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly. A phone rang somewhere down the corridor. The world continued its ordinary business around them. 2 years. The good year in Maine. The 2 weeks of fog and pine smell and morning coffee and his hands over hers on the porch railing. She had thought that was the foundation. She now understood what it actually was. She thought Derek said. He stopped. Started again. "She thought I was going to leave you. Before the pregnancy announcement. I told her I was going to leave." Oh, she had not been ready for that one. He was going to leave. He had told another woman he was leaving. Before the baby. If not for the baby, he would have been gone. And she would have learned the truth then, in the worst possible way, alone. The baby moved, one sharp, decisive kick under Caroline's ribs, the kind that cannot be ignored. Caroline put her hand on her stomach. She breathed. She took that information, which was enormous and devastating, and which she would have to sit with for a very long time in a room that was not this lobby, and she placed it carefully in the part of herself that was already past this moment. "I need you to go," she said. "I need you to leave this hospital right now. I cannot look at you right now." He nodded. He looked stricken. His face was doing things she did not have the capacity to care about. She turned and pressed the elevator button. Behind her, she heard his footsteps. Then nothing. The elevator opened. She got in. She pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. She stood in the elevator, and she did not cry, and she did not collapse, and she did not slide down the elevator wall the way part of her wanted to. She breathed. She held her own left hand with her right hand. She looked at the changing floor numbers. 6, 5, 4, 3. "We are okay," she thought. "We are okay." Not as a question. Not as a hope. As a declaration. As something she was choosing to be true by saying it. Lobby, the glass doors, the cold afternoon air on her face. It was sharper than she expected, the cold, the way outdoor air often is when you have been inside somewhere institutional. She stood on the sidewalk and let it land on her. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She stared at it for one full ring. She answered, "Miss Whitfield Bauer," a voice said. Young, careful, as though every word had been examined before being said. "My name is Amber Cole." I know who you are," Caroline said. A pause. Long enough for Caroline to hear the quality of the silence, which was the silence of a person who had been preparing for this and was now in it, and found it more difficult than preparation had accounted for. "I think we need to talk," Amber said. "I did not know about the baby. I swear to you. I did not find out until a month ago." Caroline stood on the sidewalk of the hospital. The cold air. The sound of traffic 2 blocks over. The faint smell of exhaust and something better underneath it. Something green from the park at the end of the street. The woman on the phone was the last person in the world she wanted to speak to. She was also, Caroline realized with some surprise, the first person today who sounded like she was telling the truth. "Where?" Caroline said. The coffee shop was 6 blocks from the hospital, and was the kind of place that existed in every city neighborhood without being specifically of any of them. Wooden tables, good light, the smell of something being baked, close enough to smell but not close enough to locate. Amber was already there when Caroline arrived. The camel coat was folded over the back of the chair. Without it, in a gray sweater with her dark hair loose now and her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, she looked less like a threat and more like what she was. A 29-year-old woman who had made a significant mistake and was now sitting in a coffee shop waiting to face the consequences of it. Caroline sat across from her. Neither of them spoke first. The small sound of the cafe moved around them. Other conversations, coffee equipment, something with piano in the background. "He told me you two were separated," Amber said. She did not look away when she said it. This was something. Some people cannot look at the person they have wronged. Amber looked directly at her. "He said the marriage was over in everything but the paperwork. He said it was complicated for professional reasons and financial reasons, but that it was done." Caroline wrapped both hands around her own mug. Warm. She focused on the warmth. "We were not separated," she said. "I know that now." Amber's voice was level and carefully controlled in the way of someone who has been crying and has decided to stop for this. "He kept saying the timeline was complicated. He kept saying you were making things difficult, that you did not want to let go." She paused. "3 months ago, I saw your pregnancy announcement on his sister's Instagram, and I confronted him." What did he say?" Caroline said. Amber set down her mug. "He said it was a surprise." That word. A surprise. "That you two had an accident." Her jaw tightened, a visible small thing. "He said it did not change anything between us. He said he was handling it." Handling it. Caroline thought about the nursery, the box on the floor. The mobile grant had hung because it needed to be hung and no one else was going to do it. She thought about the morning coffee he had stopped sharing, the way he had stopped saying he loved the smell of her lotion, the way the marriage had been slowly, methodically converted into logistics while she was inside it, handling it. She was the thing he was handling. "Did you love him?" Caroline said. She had not planned to ask that, but it was the only question she actually wanted the answer to. Amber looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked back up. "I thought I did," she said. "I think I loved who he was when he was with me, who I believed he was. He has a way of making you feel like you are the only person he sees." Caroline closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Yes," she said. "He does." She opened her eyes. She looked at this woman across the table. 29 years old. Marketing director. She had believed a man who was very skilled at making women believe him. She had not known the full truth. She had chosen, perhaps, not to look too hard at some of it, but she had not known the full truth. That was not nothing. It was not absolution either, but it was not nothing. They sat for a moment in the particular shared silence of two women who had been operated on by the same lie and were just now understanding the shape of what they had both been given. "I have documentation," Amber said. "Texts, emails. Things he wrote to me about the finances, about a secondary account. He moved money. He talked about it the way you talk about ordinary logistics, like it was simply a thing you do. He said it was standard. He said everyone in his position did it." She swallowed. "I thought he meant tax strategy. Something professional. I did not understand what he was protecting it from." She stopped. "I understand now," she said. "He was protecting it from you." The coffee was warm between Caroline's palms. "I deserved better than this." The thought arrived in her chest, clean and clear, not as a lament and not as a wound, as a fact. A piece of foundational information she could build on. She deserved better than this, and she had not gotten it, and she was going to make sure that it was the last time she accepted less than what she deserved. "Do you have the documentation with you?" Caroline said. "Some of it. The rest I can get. I am going to give you my attorney's contact information. If you are willing to share what you have formally, through her office, it would help my case significantly." Amber nodded. No hesitation. Caroline wrote Helen's name and number on a napkin. She passed it across the table. "I want you to understand something," she said. "I do not forgive you yet. That is a process I have not started. But I do not hold you responsible for what he is. He is what he is. He would have found someone." She paused. "He makes people feel chosen. It is a specific skill, and it is entirely in service of himself." Amber looked down at the napkin. "I was so flattered," she said. "I felt like the most important person in the room whenever I was with him. I had never felt like that before." "I know," Caroline said. "He made me feel that way too." For a while, they finished their coffees. They did not become friends. They did not become anything that had a name. What they became in 45 minutes in a coffee shop 6 blocks from a hospital was two people who had been used to operate against each other and had declined to continue being useful in that way. At the door, Amber held out her hand. Caroline shook it. Take care of yourself, Caroline said. She meant it precisely, not as a pleasantry, as instruction. As the one thing she could offer this woman that was both practical and true, she walked back to her car. She got in. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. Outside the windshield, the city moved in its usual way, a man on a bike, a dog pulling its owner towards something interesting, two women talking outside a pharmacy, one of them laughing at something, head tilted back. He never loved me, she thought. He loved the idea of me. There is a specific, sharp grief in that distinction. The grief of discovering that the thing you built your life around was not the thing you thought it was. Not the person, not the marriage. The grief is for your own love, for how sincerely you gave it, for how certain you were that it was received in kind. She let the grief arrive. She sat in the car for 6 minutes and let it land. Then she picked up her phone. She texted Helen Marsh, new source of documentation. Significant. Call when you can. Then she drove home. Helen called within the hour. Caroline was still in the car. She had not gone inside. She had parked in the garage beneath the building and sat in the flat gray fluorescent light that parking garages have, which is a light that belongs to no particular time of day, a light that suspends you slightly outside of ordinary time. She had always disliked parking garages. Today she found that quality useful. She was not ready to be anywhere real yet. Tell me, Helen said. She told her everything. Amber's account of the financial conversations, the secondary account, the LLC reference, the documentation Amber had offered to provide. On the other end of the line, Helen was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of a lawyer receiving information that is better than she expected. This is significant, Helen said. I thought it might be, Caroline. Helen's voice had a different quality now. Direct and still measured, but something in it that was also excitement. The professional kind, the kind that a person feels when the facts of a case have turned in an unexpected direction. If he moved assets with the intent to conceal them from a potential divorce proceeding, that constitutes financial misconduct. Depending on the timing and the amounts involved, it could substantially change your position, even with the prenuptial agreement in place. The infidelity clause, Caroline said. The infidelity clause is already your leverage. But if we can combine that with documented and intentional asset concealment, the prenuptial becomes significantly less protective for him than he designed it to be. A pause. He tried to protect himself from you using a legal agreement, while simultaneously violating the fundamental terms of that agreement. Legally, those two things cannot both stand. Caroline sat in the parking garage light. He outsmarted himself, she said. Yes, Helen said. Very clever men often do. Tonight you go home, you behave normally. You give him no indication that you have had this conversation or any other. Can you do that? Yes, she said. She went upstairs. Derek was home. He was subdued. Not the performing subdued of a man who wants to appear contrite while feeling nothing. The actually subdued of a man who has had a day that has shaken something loose in his understanding of his own situation. He had made dinner, which was unusual. He had set the table. He was careful with her in the specific way of a person who is afraid of what they might lose. She watched him through dinner. She watched him ask about the baby with genuine interest. She watched him try to find, in this dinner and this conversation, some path back to a version of the story where he was still in control of the narrative. He did not offer the truth, even now, even with the evidence of the afternoon between them. He said nothing about the elevator lobby. He said nothing about Amber. He arranged his face into the expression of a man who wants to move forward. He could not tell the truth, even when the truth was the only thing that could help him. She found this clarifying. That night she lay awake and did the accounting. 5 years of marriage. The apartment jointly held. The summer place in Connecticut technically his. The joint accounts, which she had access to but which were connected to his income and his investments in ways that meant they were his in every practical sense. Her landscape architecture license, current, renewed every 2 years. But 5 years without clients, 5 years without active practice, 5 years without professional standing in the particular way that 5 years of absence creates. She had left her career, gradually each individual sacrifice seeming reasonable in the moment. He traveled a lot. She could manage the house. He needed someone available when clients needed to be entertained. She could start a small independent practice later, after the first year, after they got settled, after the next year when the timing was better, after the thing he needed, after the situation improved, after the pregnancy, obviously, after had become her life. The accumulation of the individual sacrifices only became visible from a distance, from this distance. Lying awake at 11:40 in a bedroom she was about to stop sharing, doing the arithmetic of what she had given and what she had received, and finding the columns profoundly imbalanced. Somewhere along the way I became invisible, she thought. Said it out loud in a barely perceptible whisper, like naming a thing to make it real. The baby kicked. One solid, emphatic kick. She pressed her hand against it. She smiled in the dark. The small, genuine, private smile of a woman who is in an awful situation and is also in this exact moment undeniably and completely loved by the smallest possible person. "I know," she said to the dark. "I hear you." She called Grant in the morning. Derek had left early. She called from the kitchen table with her coffee. "Marcus has preliminary numbers," Grant said. "How bad?" 2.3 million, moved into an LLC he opened 4 months ago, a Delaware corporation. "The timing is before your pregnancy announcement became public." She sat with this. $2.3 million. "There is more," Grant said. "A property in Florida, purchased 18 months ago under the same Delaware corporation. Market value approximately $900,000. Caroline set down her coffee mug. "He bought a condo," she said. "He bought a condo in Florida under a shell company approximately 6 months into the relationship with this woman." "Grant," she breathed. "He was building a life. He was building a second life and putting it into a structure I could not see." "Yes." She pressed her fingers against her temple. She thought about the Maine trip. She thought about him carrying her bag off the ferry. She thought about his face in the early morning light on the porch. She thought about how certain she had been. "He has not finished," she said. "Moving things. There may be more." "Yes," Grant said. "Which is why timing matters. I need to move before he does more." "Yes," he said. "But carefully. Helen needs to be the one to make the strategic decisions about when and how." "Grant." She was very still. "I need this to be my moves. I need to lead this, not you. Your support, your resources if necessary, but my moves. Can you do that?" A long moment. "Yes," he said. "What do you need?" "Information, availability, and for you to stay in the background unless I call." "Done." She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table. She was not the same person who had lain in the hospital bed watching the empty chair. She had not planned to become someone different so quickly. But grief, when it is real and complete and not avoided, does not take as long as people think. It burns through you, and what is left on the other side of a thorough fire is not ash. It is ground. Cleared ground. She was standing on cleared ground. She was going to start building. The beginning came on a Thursday evening with tea. Derek had made it. He had made it and set it on the table and arranged himself in the chair across from her, in the particular posture of a man who is about to say something he believes will give him an advantage. She wrapped her hands around the mug and waited. "I have been thinking," he said. He used his careful voice. The one calibrated to sound reasonable and calm and unbothered, the voice she used to find reassuring and now recognized as the voice he deployed specifically when he wanted something. "I think we need to talk about what the best path forward looks like," he said, "for both of us. For the baby. I do not want us to be enemies, Caroline. I know what I did. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But I think we are both adults, and I think we can handle this like adults and avoid what could be a very costly and very public process." She looked at his folded hands on the table. She thought, he does not know about Helen Marsh. He does not know about Amber's decision to cooperate. He does not know that Marcus Reed exists or that his LC has already been found. He does not know that I know about the Florida condo. He thinks he is being generous right now. He thinks he is offering me something. "What do you propose?" she said. He talked for 11 minutes, she counted. A quiet separation agreement. One shared attorney, which would be cheaper and faster, he said, for both of them. The apartment to her, he would move out. Monthly support, modest but sufficient in his framing. A parenting plan to be developed together after the birth. He used the word amicable. He used the word collaborative. He used the word rational. He did not mention the $2.3 million. He did not mention the Florida property. He did not mention the Delaware LLC. When he finished, she looked at him for a moment. "I will need to speak with my attorney before agreeing to anything," she said. Something flickered in his expression. Just for a moment. There and gone. "You have an attorney," he said. "I do," she said. "Of course." He nodded once. He was recalculating. She could see it happening behind his eyes, the rapid, quiet mathematics of a man reassessing a situation. "Of course, that is completely reasonable. That makes sense." He left the room shortly after. She heard him on his phone, voice very low through the wall, the particular low of someone speaking quietly on purpose. She sat at the kitchen table and the wall broke. Not the directed kind of grief. Not the kind that knows what it is doing. The other kind. The kind that does not care about timing or presentation or the strategic picture. The kind that has been building since the hospital room and has been held behind a careful dam for weeks and has finally reached the moment where the dam is no longer a thing that can hold. She put her head down on the kitchen table. She cried. She cried for the marriage she had believed in. She had genuinely believed in it. That was the thing she could not think around. She had been a woman who loved her husband and wanted her marriage to work and thought it was working and gave it everything she had, and it was not what she thought it was. She cried for the woman she was when she believed it. The woman who chose the sage green paint alone and thought it was a nice Saturday. The woman who renewed her landscape architecture license and told herself she would use it after. The woman who adjusted the pillow in the hospital room 4 times and never once thought, he is not here because he is with someone else. She cried for the apartment in Brooklyn she had given up to move into his. She cried for the clients she had let drift when she stopped having time for them. She cried for the career she had slowly dismantled piece by piece under the reasonable-sounding logic of supporting her husband's more financially significant work. She cried until she was entirely empty. Then she sat up. She wiped her face. She breathed. The kitchen was exactly as it had been before she started. The light was too bright. The table had a small ring from the tea mug. The city outside was doing its nighttime things. She was still here. Her phone buzzed at 11:47. "Rosalie, you awake?" She typed back, "Yes." "Rosalie, I'm outside." She almost laughed. She pushed back from the table and went to the front door. Rosalie was there. She was in a big coat over what were clearly pajama pants. She had a bag of takeout. Her hair was not done. She looked like a person who had been watching her phone and waiting for exactly this text, and had been prepared for some version of this night for a very long time. "You texted me 3 hours ago and then went silent," Rosalie said. "I got worried." Caroline stepped aside. They sat on the kitchen floor. The takeout was from the Chinese place 2 blocks over. Cold sesame noodles. Something with scallions and peanuts that was exactly right for 11:47 at night on a kitchen floor. Rosalie did not make her talk. She did not ask careful questions designed to extract information. She simply sat. She poured sauce on her noodles. She handed Caroline the chopsticks. They ate. After a while, Caroline said, "I never liked him." Rosalie looked at her. "Excuse me, I think you mean I never liked him." Caroline started laughing. Rosalie started laughing. It was the kind of laughter that can only happen after a serious cry, the kind that is half grief still and half something else, something that insists on existing even in the middle of everything. "Say it," Caroline said. "I never liked him, Caroline. How long?" "From the 3rd date. When he ordered for you without asking." Caroline was still laughing, or crying, or both simultaneously in a way that felt necessary and true. "I defended him. You always defended him. I always let you. Because you needed to." Rosalie looked at her steadily. "I should have said it 5 years ago. I am saying it now. Starting over feels impossible," Caroline thought, "but staying feels worse." This was true in the way that only the most difficult truths are true. She did not say it as a question. She did not soften it. She held it. They ate noodles until 12:30. The sesame smell of them. The particular sound of chopsticks on cardboard containers. The city quiet enough now that she could hear the occasional car on the street below, and once a dog barking somewhere in the middle distance, and once a burst of laughter from somewhere she could not locate. Rosalie left. She gave Caroline a long, firm hug at the door. She said, "Call me for anything, I mean it. Nothing is too small." Caroline said she knew. Rosalie said, "I know you know. I am saying it out loud anyway because you need to hear it." Caroline closed the door. She went to the bedroom. Derek was asleep. She got in on her side. She lay still and breathed in the dark. She slept better than she had in weeks. This surprised her. She had expected the worst night. It was not the worst night. She had expected to lie awake cataloging everything. She had done that already. She had done the cataloging, the crying, the accounting, the floor of the kitchen, the chopsticks, and the good friend, and the laughter in the middle of the grief. And now there was nothing left to do tonight but sleep. She slept. In the morning she made coffee for one. She stood at the counter and made coffee for 1 cup only, in the small French press she had bought for herself before she ever met Derek, the one that had lived in a cabinet for 5 years because Derek preferred the machine. She made it for one person and she stood at the window and she drank it. It did not feel like forgetting. It felt like beginning. Helen's office on a Friday morning had the quality of a room in which important things regularly happen. It did not announce this. It simply had it. In the quality of the light and the cleanliness of the conference table and the way Helen moved through it with the practiced ease of someone who had navigated thousands of hours in this particular room. Marcus Reed was already there. He had a laptop and a printed document and the air of a man who had spent the previous several days working very hard and was now preparing to explain the results of that work in the clearest possible terms. Grant was in the city, but not in the room he had offered. Caroline had said this meeting was hers. He had said understood, he meant it. Marcus opened the document. $2.3 million into the Delaware LLC, established 4 months ago. The Florida property at $900,000, held under the same entity, purchased 18 months ago. But there is an additional layer. He turned the document to face her. A third property. A small commercial space in New Jersey, 12 months ago, 160,000. Same structure. Helen was making notes. Fast and precise, her pen moving over the legal pad without hesitation. He built a portfolio, Caroline said. He tried to, Marcus said. He was not finished. The movements are documented, but the transfers are incomplete. Several are still in process. He paused. We found it before he finished moving it. What does that mean for us? Caroline said. Helen looked up from her notes. It means we can freeze it. As part of the initial divorce filing, we request a court order freezing the LLC assets and the associated properties. This prevents him from moving anything further while proceedings are active. And the prenuptial agreement. The infidelity clause in the prenuptial makes the agreement voidable in the areas where the infidelity occurred. But the asset concealment argument is potentially stronger. Helen set down her pen. In this state, a spouse who deliberately conceals marital assets with the intent to reduce what the other party would receive in divorce proceedings has committed financial misconduct. It is a recognized legal standard. Combined with Amber Cole's documentation of conversations in which Derek explicitly discussed the movements in the context of the marriage, we have a significantly strong case for voiding the financial protections of the prenuptial in the areas of the concealed assets. Caroline looked at the printed numbers on the table. $3.36 million. That was the approximate value of what he had moved. $3.36 million shifted into entities she had not known existed by a man who had been making her coffee in the mornings and asking how she slept. She thought about the nursery. She thought about the mobile turning in the draft. She thought about the sage green she had chosen alone, and the crib she had assembled alone, and the rocking chair she had ordered from a catalog and assembled alone with the instruction pamphlet on the floor and her hair in a ponytail, and no one helping. She was not building her child's life around a man who moved $3 million in secret and could not be bothered to hang a mobile. File, she said. Helen looked at her. I want to be clear about what this initiates. Once we file, we proceed on the documented facts. Derek will be served. He will retain counsel. The freeze request will be heard on an expedited basis given the pregnancy timeline. This will not be quiet. Good, Caroline said. Helen nodded once. Then we proceed. That afternoon, the papers were prepared. Before Derek came home, the filing had been initiated. The freeze request was in motion. Caroline made dinner. She set the table and then stood looking at the two-place settings she had set from habit. She picked up the second plate. She put it back in the cabinet. She ate alone. My child will not grow up thinking this is what love looks like. The thought arrived in her chest with the weight and certainty of something she had known without knowing she knew it. A child watches. A child absorbs. A child learns the shape of love from the shape of the love around her. And this child, this specific small being who kicked with opinions and rolled with intentions and pressed back when Caroline pressed her hand against her side, this child deserved to see what love actually was. Caroline was going to make sure she saw it. She cleared the table. She washed the dish. She dried it and put it away and stood for a moment with her back against the counter, looking at the kitchen she would keep. She was not afraid. She was steady. She breathed. The coffee shop was hers now. She had started coming here in the mornings 3 weeks ago, when Derek was still sleeping, when the apartment felt too small for the size of what she was carrying. She came here with a book, and her one-cup French press was replaced by their good drip coffee with the particular quality of coffee made in volume but made well. She chose the same chair every morning, the one by the window, the one that looked out at the street. She was in that chair on a Monday morning, with a book open in front of her when Derek called. The time was 9:52. She answered. You filed, he said. Not a question. My attorney filed, she said. Yes. We discussed handling this without attorneys involved. You discussed that, she said. I did not agree to it, Caroline. The quality of his voice had shifted. The careful warmth was gone. There was something harder under it now, something that was more genuinely him. We had a conversation in which you said, Derek, she said. She kept her voice even. She kept it the way Helen had told her to keep it, the way she had been practicing in the mornings, the way that is neither angry nor apologetic but simply clear. I know about the LLC. I know about the Florida property. I know about the New Jersey commercial space. I know the name of the Delaware Corporation, when it was incorporated, and how much was transferred into it. My attorney knows all of this. The court knows all of this as of this morning. Silence. It was the silence of a man who has been very clever for a very long time, arriving at the end of his cleverness. She could feel it through the phone, the recalculating, the rapid reassessment of every assumption he had made about this situation and about her. Who told you, he said. It does not matter who, she said. It is documented. That is what matters. I want to talk about this, face to face. Tonight. You speak to Helen Marsh, she said. Her contact information is in the filing documents. That is how this works from here. She ended the call. She set the phone on the table. She looked out the window. A man walked a large brown dog on the other side of the glass. Two women stood talking at the corner, one of them gesturing with both hands at something she was explaining. A delivery person went by on a bike with a very large insulated bag. The city was doing its ordinary Monday things. Her hands were on the table. She looked at them. They were steady. She was 34 years old, 30 weeks pregnant. Her husband had just learned that she had found the financial structure he spent 2 years building to protect himself from her, and her hands were steady. She had not expected this. She had expected to be shaking. She had expected the physical manifestation of what it felt like to do the single most consequential thing she had ever done. She had expected her body to make it dramatic. Her body was still. She looked at the open book on the table. She had not read any of it since she sat down. She read 2 pages. She went back and read them again because she had not absorbed them the first time either. She folded down the corner and closed it. Grant called. His attorney contacted my office this morning, Grant said. They implied that a protracted public divorce filing might create reputational complications for Whitfield Capital's portfolio connections. A pause. It was a soft threat. He is threatening you, she said. He is attempting to. It will not work. Grant's voice had the quality it had when something had made him very calm instead of very angry, which was the most precise indication of how serious a thing was to him. But I wanted you to know. Caroline, let him try. I have been waiting for 20 years for someone to attempt to use my company as leverage against my family. He paused. This is not a threat. It is an invitation. Do not do anything aggressive, she said. This is mine. I need it to stay mine, I know. Your proceedings are yours entirely. He cannot touch me through them. A brief pause. How are you feeling? Stronger than I expected, she said. Which is strange. It is not strange, Grant said. You have been strong for years. You just have not been using it for yourself. She sat with that. She had spent years making herself smaller so he could feel larger, she thought. I am done shrinking. This arrived not as a decision but as a recognition of something already true. She had already stopped. The stopping had begun in the hospital room when she sent Grant a room number. It had continued in the parking garage and on Helen's floor, and in the coffee shop with Amber Cole, and on the kitchen floor with Rosalie. She had been unshrinking for weeks. It was only now in this chair with this window and these steady hands that she saw the full shape of it. She put a generous tip on the table. She put on her coat. She went home. She went to the nursery. She sat in the rocking chair she had ordered from a catalog and assembled herself with the instruction pamphlet on the floor beside her, sitting cross-legged at 8 months pregnant, because the nursery was ready when it was ready, and she was not going to wait for someone who was not coming. She put her hands on her stomach. We are going to be okay, she said, to the baby, to the room, to the person she was becoming. Both of us. The baby pressed back. Firm and certain, she rocked slowly. The chair made a small, rhythmic sound on the hardwood. The mobile of stars turned in the air. The city was audible outside but distant. The way city sound is when you are in a room that has been prepared for something small and new, she breathed. Terrence Wolfe arrived 7 minutes late. He was 53, heavy in the jaw, and moved through the world with the specific confidence of a man whose career had been built on making other people uncomfortable. He shook Helen's hand. He did not look at Caroline. He took the chair across the table with the unhurriedness of a man who was entirely certain he had the most powerful position in the room. He did not have the most powerful position in the room. Caroline had asked Helen before the meeting, what should I do? Helen had said, watch, do not react. You are the client. Let me be the attorney. This suited Caroline. She was good at watching. She had been practicing for years. Terrence Wolfe opened by saying that the LLC was a legitimate business structure established for entirely defensible investment purposes. He said the Florida property was a sound asset acquisition with no connection to the marriage. He used the word speculative 3 times in the first 8 minutes. He implied that the documentation Amber Cole had provided was potentially unreliable given its source. He offered a settlement structure that was approximately 1/4 of what Helen had told Caroline to expect. Helen listened. She made 3 notes on her legal pad. Small, efficient notes, the kind made by a person who is hearing things they already knew were coming and is noting only what is useful. When Terrence Wolfe finished, Helen smiled pleasantly at him in the way of a person who has been in rooms like this 1 more times than she can count. Before we continue, Helen said, I would like to share something with you. She slid a document across the table. Caroline watched Terrence Wolfe read it. It was a series of text messages, 11 months old. In them, Derek discussed the LLC in the context of marital finances. He used specific language that could not be interpreted as anything other than what it was. In one message, he referenced the goal of moving assets before things get complicated with the situation at home. In another, he was explicit about the timing relative to the anticipated divorce. Terrence Wolfe read the document. He did not say speculative again. The meeting ran for 2 hours and 15 minutes. Nothing was settled. Settlement meetings rarely result in immediate settlement. What they result in is a shift in understanding. In this meeting, Terrence Wolfe understood, by the time he left, that he did not have the position he had entered believing he had. That was sufficient for today. Patricia arrived that evening. Caroline had called her mother 3 days ago. Not for strategy, not for information. Simply because she wanted her mother and she had spent too long not saying so. Patricia had driven down from the house in Virginia. She arrived with 2 bags of groceries and the particular manner of a woman who has made her assessment and has decided that her place is exactly here. Over dinner, Patricia said, "I knew from the first time I sat across from that man." Caroline looked up from her plate. "There is a kind of man," Patricia said, "who looks through women rather than at them, who listens for the ends of sentences so he can speak, rather than because he is interested in what the sentence contains. I watched him do this to you for 5 years, and I said nothing because I knew what you would say." "I would have defended him," Caroline said. "You would have," Patricia said. "And you would have been right that it was your life to live, and we would have ended up farther apart, and you would have stayed anyway, and I would have lost you and lost the ability to be useful to you when you needed me." Caroline turned this over. "When did you get wise about my marriage?" she said. "About a year in," Patricia said. "When he interrupted you at that dinner in March and you apologized. I apologized for being interrupted." "Yes," Patricia said. They sat with that. "When did you get wise?" Patricia said. "Recently," Caroline said. "Very recently." Patricia nodded. She refilled Caroline's water glass. She did it without asking. She did not make it significant. She simply did it because it was a thing that needed doing, and she was in the position to do it. Patricia stayed through the week. On Saturday morning, Derek arrived with 2 men in a rented van to collect his belongings. They had agreed, through the attorneys, that he would take personal items and certain furnishings that were clearly his and would leave within 2 hours. Patricia was in the kitchen when he arrived, making coffee. She did not come out to greet him. She did not leave the kitchen. She remained visible through the doorway, entirely comfortable, moving through the kitchen with the ease of someone in her own space, which was not technically true, but was true in every way that mattered. Derek did not look at his mother-in-law once. He took 4 boxes and 3 bags and a painting he had brought to the marriage and left without saying anything to Caroline that was not logistical. When the door closed behind him for the last time, Patricia brought 2 cups of tea to the kitchen table. She set one in front of Caroline. She sat down across from her. "Well," she said. "Well," Caroline said. "That was enough. That was exactly enough." The specific sufficiency of a small word between 2 women who had both lived inside difficult truths without naming them for too long and are now in this kitchen on the other side. The 3rd week brought something Marcus Reed had not been specifically looking for. He had been examining the financial structure of the LLC. He had been tracing the asset transfers. He had been building the documentary case that would support Helen's legal arguments. And in the course of this work, he found something else. A development deal. A large one. A mixed-use commercial and residential project in New Jersey. The kind of project that was Derek's specialty. The kind that generated substantial commission income. In this deal, Derek had directed a portion of the commission through the Delaware LLC before the deal closed. He had done this in a way that was not obviously illegal. It did not appear in any document as fraud. It appeared in the documents as a routine financial arrangement. But it was not routine. It was a conflict of interest. And he had not disclosed it to the board of his firm. He was redirecting commission income, Marcus said. He laid the documentation on Helen's conference table. He was a man who delivered difficult information with the same directness that he delivered everything, without cushioning and without drama. Through the same structure he was using to conceal assets from me, Caroline said. "Yes," Marcus said. So he was using the same entity for 2 different forms of financial manipulation. One personal, one professional. In effect, yes. Caroline sat back. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at Marcus and then at Helen. "This is beyond the scope of the divorce," she said. "Yes," Helen said. "If the board finds out, he loses his position." "Almost certainly," Marcus said. "And if he loses his position, his financial situation changes significantly, which affects the settlement calculation, which affects what my attorney can secure for me and for my child." She was working through it out loud, the way she used to work through a complex landscape design, understanding all the elements before she made a recommendation. But the board finding out would also destabilize my child's father professionally. The child I am carrying will have Derek as her father for the rest of her life. Regardless of what he has done to me, she will have to navigate that relationship. I am not going to burn down her father's career as a move in my divorce proceedings. The room was quiet. There is another option, Helen said carefully. You hold the information. You do not disclose it to the board. You do not use it as a public weapon. But you ensure that Derek knows you have it. It becomes implicit leverage in the settlement negotiation without becoming a weapon deployed in public. He knows that I know, Caroline said. He knows that I can disclose it if I choose to. Which means he knows that the cost of fighting me in this settlement exceeds the cost of settling. Correct, Helen said. Caroline was still. She thought about what kind of person she wanted to be on the other side of this. She thought about Rosalie on her kitchen floor at midnight with cold sesame noodles. She thought about Grant in the hospital chair. She thought about her mother making tea and saying, well, she had people around her who were not cruel. She had been sustained by people who were not cruel. She did not want to become someone cruel in the process of being wronged. I hold it, she said. I do not disclose. I ensure he knows through the negotiation process that it exists and that I have it, and we let his own knowledge of that shape what he offers. Helen smiled. Not the professional smile, the other one. That is an elegant approach. It is what he would do, Caroline said. But I am doing it honestly. I am not hiding the existence of the information. I am simply choosing not to use it in a way that causes collateral damage to people who do not deserve it. She played the card. The next offer from Terrence Wolfe was the first Helen described as approaching reasonable. The apartment without contest. The freeze on the LLC. Assets acknowledged as valid. The Florida property to be included in settlement discussions. A monthly support figure that was substantively different from what had been offered in the first meeting. Rosalie called that evening. He blinked, she said. He did not have a choice, Caroline said. No, Rosalie said. He really did not. Caroline was 32 weeks along. She had 2 months. She had a nursery with a mobile of stars. She had a rocking chair and a bookshelf and a rug in a pattern she had loved immediately. She had a mother who arrived with groceries and remained in kitchens. She had a brother who answered on the first ring. She was not who she was when this started. She was larger, not louder, not harder. Larger in the way that clarity makes a person larger. She took up more space, not because she had grown aggressive, because she had stopped spending energy on making herself smaller. That energy was available now for other things. She thought about what she wanted to build. She thought about it the way she used to think about a new design. Standing at the beginning of an empty space, understanding its conditions, its light, its drainage, its soil. What would survive here? What would flourish? What needed structure and what needed room to be wild? She was standing at the beginning of an empty space. She picked up a pencil and began to sketch. She did not cause the leak. She did not prevent it either. The information about the commission redirect existed in documents that Marcus Reed had assembled, that were referenced in Helen's communications, that had been made implicit in the settlement negotiations. It existed in the files of people who had reasons to know it, and information that exists in files has a way of moving. Derek's colleague, a man named Philip Garner, had worked with Derek for 9 years. He had watched Derek take credit for collaborative work. He had watched Derek steer clients toward deals that advantaged Derek's portfolio. He had spent 9 years being the quietly indispensable person in the room that Derek made sure never received appropriate recognition. Philip Garner came into possession of a rumor. Caroline did not know how. She did not ask. He brought the rumor to the right people in the right form, and within 3 days it had reached the board. Derek called her at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. "Did you do this?" he said. She was at the kitchen table. She had a cup of tea. The morning light came through the window at the angle she had learned to expect. She looked at the light. "No," she said, and it was true. "Derek, I told you I would not use it as a weapon. I did not. I do not know who talked. It was not me." A silence, Caroline. His voice was compressed in a way she had not heard before, the specific compression of a man whose carefully maintained structures are simultaneously collapsing. "I am sorry," she said. She meant it. Not sorry for him, exactly. Sorry for the nature of cause and effect. Sorry for what it felt like to stand in the path of consequences that were the direct result of your own choices. She knew something about that. "I am sorry," she said again. He hung up. Terrence Wolfe called Helen that afternoon with a message that required no interpretation. His client was prepared to proceed to full settlement on terms that were substantially aligned with Helen's original position. The board investigation had created a situation in which prolonged public proceedings were no longer in Derek's professional or financial interest. The settlement was reached on a Thursday. Helen called Caroline from the office. "It is done," she said. Caroline was at the coffee shop, her chair, her book open to the page she had been reading all morning without reading. The coffee was warm. "Is it really done?" Caroline said. "It is really done," Helen said. She set the phone down. The apartment secured, support structured through her daughter's college years. A portion of the LLC assets, once unfrozen, allocated through the settlement in a way that represented genuine financial security. The Florida property to be sold with a portion of the proceeds to Caroline. The prenuptial agreement voided in the areas where Derek had violated its terms. Real settlements are not perfect. This one was not perfect. It was real. It was the shape of what she had documented, which was formidable. It was enough. More than enough. Enough to build on. The prison door had always been open, she thought. She had simply been convinced it was locked. She closed her book. She put it in her bag. She left a good tip on the table. She walked home from the coffee shop. 30 minutes. The city in late winter, which meant cold that was slowly beginning to question itself. The light had the particular quality of light that comes just before things start to change. Sharp, clean. Not quite hopeful yet, but edging toward it. She called Grant. "It is done," she said. "Good," he said. "Then you did this." "I know," she said. "Good, I want to make sure you know." She laughed a little. "I know the difference between support and ownership, Grant." "I know you do," he said. "I am saying it out loud anyway." She walked the long way home. She walked past the park and through the side streets and along the block where there was a flower shop she liked that had its buckets outside even in February. She paused at the buckets. White tulips. Something yellow she did not know the name of. Eucalyptus with its clean medicinal smell that she had always found oddly comforting. She bought white tulips. She carried them home. The apartment was warm when she got inside. Patricia was there. Something with garlic and tomatoes on the stove, the smell of it filling the hall. Patricia looked up when she walked in. She looked at Caroline's face. She looked at the tulips. "Well," she said. "It is over," Caroline said. "The settlement is signed." Patricia nodded once. She turned back to the stove. "Sit down," she said. "Dinner in 20 minutes." Caroline sat at the table. She put the tulips in a glass of water. She looked at them, white and clean and leaning slightly toward the window like the way flowers do. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at her own hands. They were her hands, entirely her own. She had always had them. They had always been capable of what they were capable of. She had just spent 5 years using their capacity primarily in service of someone else's life. That was over. The evening light came through the kitchen window. It went gold over the table and the tulips in her own hands and the room that was entirely hers. This was the first evening of her next life. She was ready for it. She saw Derek one more time before the baby arrived. It was required. Not by sentiment, by paperwork. There were documents that needed physical signatures in the same room. Helen was there. Terrence Wolfe was there. They met in a conference room that belonged to a third party, a space that was entirely neutral, that had no history attached to it, that was simply 4 walls and a table and fluorescent light and the accumulated bureaucratic weight of things ending. Derek looked changed. Not broken. She did not want to think of him as broken. That was not the word. Compressed. He had the quality of a man who has been through something that has permanently revised his understanding of his own invulnerability. The board investigation had concluded. He was still employed. His role had been restructured. He was no longer the regional vice president. He held a different title now. Smaller. He still had his intelligence and his education and his skill at charming rooms. He was going to be fine in the ordinary sense of fine. She did not feel satisfaction at this. She had expected to. She felt instead a kind of neutral clarity. The way you feel about a building that has been cleared. You can see the footprint of what used to stand there, but the thing itself is gone. The documents were signed. She stood. She shook Terrence Wolfe's hand, professionally and completely. She did not shake Derek's hand. Not because she was punishing him, because there was nothing between them now that the gesture would accurately represent. At the door, he said her name. She turned. He was looking at her with the specific quality of a man looking for something in a person's face. For recognition, maybe. For a version of her that would still respond to him in the way she used to respond. For the Caroline who would fill in his silences and manage his emotions and make the story of this easier for him to bear. She was not that person. "I will send the baby's schedule through the attorneys," she said, "for your visits. When she is old enough." He nodded. She went. The hallway outside the conference room was long and well lit and had windows at the far end that looked out at the city in an eastern configuration. She walked the length of it. Her footsteps made a sound on the polished floor. She was 35 weeks pregnant, and her center of gravity had shifted in the way it does in the final weeks, and she walked with the particular deliberateness of a woman carrying something important and knowing exactly where she is going. She was going forward. That was all she needed to know. That evening she had dinner with Rosalie and Rosalie's husband Marco and their two children, Marigold, who was 6, and Theo, who was 8. They lived in a fourth-floor apartment in the neighborhood Rosalie had refused to leave, even when real estate logic suggested she should. The apartment had books everywhere, and a kitchen table that had clearly been the site of many, many meals, and a particular warm chaos that felt like a home instead of a house. They had pasta. The children both talked about school simultaneously and at high volume, and Marco refereed and Rosalie served, and it was ordinary in the way that only things people love are ordinary. After dinner, they watched a movie. An animated one that Marigold had seen 17 times and still watched with complete investment as though she did not know how it ended. Marigold fell asleep about 2/3 of the way through, against Caroline's arm. One small warm weight, entirely trusting, entirely at ease, leaning into the person next to her without question. Caroline did not move. She sat very still and did not move and looked at this small sleeping face against her arm. This is what it feels like, she thought, being needed by someone small and real and uncomplicated. This is what love actually is. Not the performance of love, not the management of love, just this. Just the weight of a sleeping child and the sound of the movie and the smell of tomatoes still in the kitchen and the particular feeling of being exactly where you were supposed to be. She drove home in the dark. The city had gone into its late evening mode, quieter but still fully present, the lights of it scattered and purposeful. She put her hand on her stomach at a red light. The baby pressed back, immediately and firmly. A small declaration. "I know," Caroline said. Almost time. She parked, she went upstairs, she made tea. She stood in the kitchen and drank it and looked at the window. She went to the nursery. She sat in the rocking chair. She put her feet on the small stool she had positioned there weeks ago. She looked at the mobile of stars, turning slowly in whatever slight air movement the room held. Silver and pale blue and that soft white that turned light gentle. She thought about Grant, hanging it without ceremony. Going to the nursery without asking permission, opening the box, reading the instructions, hanging the mobile because it needed to be hung. She thought about what that said. What that kind of quiet, uncalculating love said about the person who offered it. She thought about Rosalie at midnight with takeout. She thought about Helen leaning forward over the conference table with the specific warmth of a person who was also a human being underneath the professional precision. She thought about Dr. Voss, whose voice never changed volume regardless of the chaos around her. She thought about Patricia, visible in the kitchen doorway while Derek collected his boxes. Not saying a word, simply remaining. Simply refusing to be somewhere other than exactly here. I have been surrounded by people who love me, she thought. I just could not see them clearly through him. He had not blocked them deliberately. That was the thing about a marriage that slowly becomes a diminishment. You do not lose the people around you in one dramatic moment. You lose them gradually, in the way you lose your peripheral vision without noticing, in the way the field of what you can see narrows down and down until the marriage and its needs are the only thing clearly in focus. She could see clearly now. She looked at the stars. She breathed. For the first time in years, she simply breathed. Not strategically. Not in preparation for the next thing. Just the breath itself, in and out, full and complete. In a room she had prepared with her own hands for a person she had not yet met. She was ready. The baby was born on a Sunday. April had arrived as it always did, with the quality of a season that has not quite committed. Some mornings gray. Some mornings bright with a sharpness that belonged to the season just ending. The trees had begun their early reaching, the small translucent green of new leaves that seemed impossible to believe in, and then believed in themselves. Her water broke at 4:15 in the morning. She had been asleep. Not well asleep. The deep, comfortable sleep of the last trimester had become a thing of memory, replaced by the lighter, more provisional sleep of a body that knows something is approaching. She had been in the space between sleep and waking, when the specific warmth of it happened, and she was completely awake. She sat up. She breathed. She sat there in the dark of her bedroom for about 1 full minute, one hand on her stomach, breathing, feeling the particular mixture of readiness and wonder and complete, irreducible enormity that had no adequate description. She called Dr. Voss. Dr. Voss asked 3 questions in the precise and unhurried way of a clinician who had been through this many thousands of times and found that unhurried was the most useful quality she could bring to it. She said, "Go to the hospital." She said, "I will meet you there." Caroline called Patricia. Patricia answered on the first ring. She said, "I will be there in 15 minutes. Caroline said, "Patricia, You live 45 minutes away. Patricia said, I will be there in 15 minutes. In the car, while Patricia drove with both hands on the wheel and the particular concentration of a woman performing an important task, Caroline called Grant. It is time, she said. I will be there in 35 minutes, he said. He was there in 35 minutes exactly. She would confirm this later against the timestamps on her phone and find it accurate to the minute. The labor was not what the books had described. It was harder and more demanding and less romanticizable than any description she had encountered. It was also in a way that surprised her precisely itself, not what she had expected, what it actually was. Patricia was on her left. She had arrived in the delivery room without anyone questioning her right to be there, because Patricia Whitfield had the particular quality of a woman who knows exactly where she belongs, and the entire clinical staff had registered this within about 30 seconds. Rosalie arrived at 8. She stationed herself on Caroline's right. She had driven from Brooklyn in early morning traffic and arrived with a coffee she had not finished, and the expression of someone who had been ready for this specific moment for a long time. Grant was in the waiting room. He had offered to come in. Caroline had said no. He had said understood. And she understood that he had understood completely, that he knew the difference between the room where he belonged and the room where she needed to do this with exactly the people she had chosen. Dr. Voss came in at intervals throughout the morning. Her voice was what it always was, unhurried, certain, the voice of someone who had attended thousands of arrivals and had not let any of them make her careless. At 2:17 in the afternoon on a Sunday in late April, Elsa June Whitfield was born. Not Bauer. Whitfield. This had been decided in the second week after the hospital room. Not in anger, not as a weapon, as a statement of truth. This child would carry the name of the line she came from, the name that connected her to the people who were going to be her people. Her grandmother with her steadiness and her perfect timing. Her uncle with his quiet presence and his willingness to sit in empty chairs. Her mother who was standing at the beginning of the rest of her life. Elsa June Whitfield arrived at 2:17 and immediately expressed an opinion about it. She arrived red-faced and emphatic and furious at the brightness of the room, having been adequately comfortable in the dark for 9 months and finding the new arrangement entirely without her consent. She was small. She was astonishing. She was the most entirely herself person Caroline had ever seen in her life. Caroline held her daughter. The world contracted to exactly the size of what she was holding. Small arms that had been operating entirely inside of her for 38 weeks, now released into space. The specific weight of a new person who is both weightless and the heaviest thing you have ever carried. The smell of her, there is a smell of a newborn that has no analog. It cannot be approximated or described. You simply smell it and you understand something about what the word necessary means. Caroline looked at her daughter's face. Hey, she said, barely audible. Not much above a breath. Hi, I am your mom. Elsa stopped crying. For exactly 1 second, she stopped crying and opened her eyes. Dark and unfocused and looking at everything and at nothing, the way new eyes do when they are still learning the concept of visual information. She looked in the direction of Caroline's voice. Then she resumed her opinion about the lighting. Caroline was crying, the earned kind. The kind that does not require explanation because the reasons are self-evident and they are enormous, and they are also, somehow, entirely joyful. Patricia leaned in over Caroline's shoulder. She looked at her granddaughter with an expression that was completely and entirely too large for the small room. Oh, Patricia said, just that? Oh. Rosalie was crying loudly, and did not stop and did not apologize for it, and was absolutely correct not to. The nurse came to do the things nurses do. Dr. Voss was there with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that the best thing she could do now was let the room be what it was. The room was everything. It smelled like the specific combination of medical cleanliness and the lotion Caroline had worn for 12 years, and something new underneath, something that was Elsa, entirely and only Elsa. The light through the window was the late afternoon light of late April, which had finally committed to being the season it had been edging toward. They called Grant in. He came through the door with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who understands that they are entering a significant moment and wants to enter it correctly. He stood at the foot of the bed. He looked at the baby. He looked at his sister. Something happened to his face that Grant's face rarely permitted. Well, he said, barely above a whisper. Well, Caroline said. He sat in the chair at the side of the room. He stayed for 3 hours. He did not need to be spoken to. He did not need to be included. He was simply present. In the particular way he had always been present when it mattered most, the way that was entirely sufficient on its own. He was excellent at sitting. He had always been excellent at sitting in the chairs that needed to be occupied. 6 weeks later on a Wednesday, Caroline walked into the office of Beth Larson. Beth Larson's firm occupied the second floor of a brownstone on a street Caroline had always liked. The plants in the window boxes were something specific and well-chosen, and she had noted them on the way up the stairs with the automatic professional attention that was simply part of how she moved through the world. She arrived with Elsa in a carrier against her chest. She had not asked whether this was acceptable. She had not apologized for it in advance. She simply arrived with her daughter at the meeting she had requested. Beth Larson had been a colleague before Derek. They had overlapped at a firm for 2 years. They had occasionally referred clients to each other. They had the relationship of two professional women who respected each other's work without having had occasion to spend significant time together. Beth Larson looked at Elsa with genuine and uncomplicated delight. She looked at Caroline with the specific attention of a person who values good work and is about to have a conversation about whether it is available. "I always hoped you would come back," Beth said. "I always knew I would," Caroline said. "Eventually." "What changed?" Beth said. Caroline thought about the hospital room. She thought about the empty chair. She thought about what the empty chair had eventually caused her to do. "Everything changed," she said, "and then I remembered who I was before the everything." The arrangement was made. Part-time consulting. Flexible schedule. A client every week or two to start, with room to grow into more as Elsa grew and the new rhythms of the new life became known to her. The first client was a family in Brooklyn. They had a brownstone with a backyard that had not been attended in years. The soil was compacted. The light came in at a low angle in the afternoons. There was an existing fig tree in the back corner that had survived years of neglect and was going to survive whatever came next. Caroline walked the space with Elsa in the carrier. She assessed the drainage and the light and the existing conditions with the complete and patient attention of someone who has learned, through years and through loss and through the specific clarity of starting over, to understand what a space requires before you try to tell it what it should be. "What do you see?" the homeowner asked. "I see what wants to live here," Caroline said. "You just have to know the conditions. You have to respect the conditions." She made her recommendation. She drew the design with its specific choices. "This plant here, this one needs shade. This one will spread if you give it room. This one needs structure to grow toward." She knew exactly what she was talking about. On a Friday evening in June, when the city had finally stopped pretending it was something other than summer, and the light went golden at the hour before dark, Caroline stood at the kitchen window with Elsa and the carrier against her chest. Her kitchen window. The small one on the north side, the one she had always liked, the one she had stood at exactly twice in 5 years, because Derek preferred the views from the south side of the apartment and she had gradually oriented herself toward what he preferred. She stood at this window now because she liked it, because she could. Elsa made a small sound. Not distress. Something that was the baby version of "here I am," which is a statement Elsa made frequently and with complete conviction. "I know," Caroline said. "Here we are." The city outside the window was doing its summer Friday evening thing. People going somewhere. A couple walking below with ice cream, both of them eating theirs before it melted. Music from somewhere she could not locate. Something with a good beat, the kind of music that is playing because someone is happy enough to play it. She looked out at all of it. She thought about the monitor. 142 beats per minute. The empty chair. The man through the small rectangular window, his hands over the hands of someone else, holding something he was afraid of losing. She thought about who she was that night. The woman adjusting the pillow 4 times. Making herself smaller in a hospital bed, trying to take up less room in her own emergency. She thought about the kitchen floor, the cereal bowl. The way she had told Grant, "I did not want this to be my life. It was not going to stay this way," he had said. He had been right. She thought about Helen's office and the prenuptial agreement and the weight of information about a man who had been building a second life with the same hands he used to hold hers. She thought about the parking garage and Amber Cole in a camel coat folded over the back of a chair. She thought about Rosalie in the doorway at midnight with takeout. She thought about Patricia just remaining in kitchen doorways at the stove in the passenger seat of the car at 4 in the morning. She thought about Elsa pressing back against her hand every time as if to say, "I am here. I am with you." This is the beginning, she thought, not the end. Not the old beginning that was actually a slow narrowing, a gradual reduction, a marriage that worked by making her smaller and smaller until she barely recognized the shape of herself. This is the real beginning, the one that opens. She had spent years convinced that she had to choose between her dignity and her security. She had solved that problem by understanding that dignity, real dignity, the kind that comes from knowing yourself and acting accordingly, was the only genuine security there was. She had spent years living inside someone else's story. That story had ended. She was writing a different one now, one where she was not the supporting character, one where she knew her own name. Elsa pressed herself against Caroline's chest, the warm weight of her, the small, reliable heartbeat that Caroline could feel through the carrier, 140-something beats per minute. Strong and steady and entirely herself. The city went golden. Caroline turned from the window. She started dinner. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who knows what she is doing, who knows the conditions, who has walked the space and understood the light and made the choices that respect what is already here, while making room for what is ready to grow. She had made herself smaller for years so that he could feel larger. She was done shrinking. She chopped the garlic. She heated the oil. She heard Elsa make another sound, the comfortable kind, the settling-in kind, and she adjusted the carrier with one practiced motion and kept cooking. The apartment smelled like garlic and olive oil and something beginning. Outside, the city was doing its ordinary work. Inside, for the first time in years, everything was exactly right. She had survived. More than survived. She was here, in her own kitchen, at her own window, in her own life, with her daughter against her chest and a career she was rebuilding, and a family she had never truly lost, and the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of a woman who knows who she is because she had to find out the hard way. The finding was done. What came next was the building. She was ready. She had always been ready. She had simply needed to remember.